Welcome to episode 3 of MTG Vintage Flashback. Today we'll be looking into the lore behind one of Magic's most fabled groups, the Elder Dragons. With the release of Magic 2019 just around the corner, one returning cycle that has players buzzing is the Elder Dragons of Dominia, or sometimes called Dominaria, otherwise simply known as the Elder Dragons. There were only a handful of survivors of the Elder Dragon War, which is the oldest piece of history we have about the Magic multiverse. Within the lore of Magic, all dragons are said to be descendants of the Dragon, which is more or less a dragon energy force from which all dragons originate. The Elder Dragon War raged on and left just 7 survivors: Nicol Bolas, Ugin, Chromium Ruel, palladia-mors, and Arcades Sabbath, who were siblings, along with their cousins Victus Asmati and Piru. For the purposes of this video, we'll focus on the Elder Dragons who were represented in the original cycle from Legends: Arcades, Chromium, Nicol Bolas, Palladia, and Victus. Not only was this the first gold-bordered cycle, but it was also the first legendary creature cycle. Piru has only been casually mentioned in the paper card game, with the sole specific reference to her being in the flavor text for the recently printed card, Blackblade Reforged. It spilled the blood of one Elder Dragon. In Gideon's hands, it may yet taste another's. This is in reference to the slaying of Piru by legendary human warrior Dakon Blackblade. Of course, Ugin was largely introduced and explored during the Khans of Tarkir block. How did the Elder Dragons come about? This looks like it will be addressed in the storyline of M19, which is based on the 2 Chronicles of Bolas stories written by Kate Elliott. It has been said that this storyline will focus on filling in details of the past rather than the current storyline, which is also hinted by the fact that most of the returning elders have already been killed in the current timeline. Much of the current lore comes from a 2-part Armada comic series titled Elder Dragons, though there have been revisions to some details over time. These dragons are also credited as being the inspiration for one of Magic's most popular formats, Commander. Commander was originally, and is still affectionately called, Elder Dragon Highlander due to the fact that during the game's inception, players usually used legendary creatures from the Legends expansion, notably the Elder Dragons, as the deck's commander. Arcades was the first to be hatched among the Elder Dragons, and therefore the first to be named. He has a somewhat uneventful storyline in that after hatching, he quickly became uninterested in watching his remaining siblings hatch, and instead headed towards human development in the distance. Losing interest in the lost egg stones, Arcades sweeps out his wings and flies towards the assemblage of structures. After discovering the settlement, Arcades found himself fascinated with human culture and decided to reign over the society, which oddly enough resulted in times of peace for this culture. There is little solid evidence on the death of Arcades. The only piece of evidence which seems to propose his death is a bit of dialogue during the summit of the Null Moon, in which it is stated that Leshrock forcibly summoned Chromium's brother, who fell to Leshrock's opponent Christina. Later information would reveal that Nicol Bolas was already a planeswalker at this point and could not be summoned, so the reference to summoning a brother of Chromium's can supposedly only be in reference to Arcades. The summit of the Null Moon was also a pivotal moment for Chromium, but we'll return to that in a moment. Chromium was the second of his siblings to be hatched, and his personality traits tended to be those of curiosity and interest. Chromium, along with his life partner / cousin Piru, would go on to serve a demonic planeswalker by the name of Geodrone Dihada. Dihada eventually incited a battle with Dakon Blackblade, which spurred the short Blackblade Dihada War. It was in this conflict that Piru was slain and Chromium disappeared. In a small village, a young child is said to have stumbled about a cave that Chromium and palladia-mors resided. Despite Palladia's vicious objections, Chromium was intrigued by the lack of fear in the child. The local townsfolk, upon the poor guidance of a wizard, reacted violently to the presence of the dragons, and that caused Palladia to retaliate. This killed hundreds and set the town on fire. A strange man by the name of Ham appeared and cast the first Tickery spell on Palladia, which sent her into a deep slumber, then buried her beneath the village, giving the town its name of Mors Ridge. The strange man was actually Chromium using his shape-shifting abilities to disguise himself as a human. This shape-shifting ability is vaguely referenced in the activated ability of the new card Chromium the Mutable. He maintained a role while hiding as Ham on the High Council of Mors Ridge for some time, in which he occasionally reapplied the Tickery spell to palladia-mors. Chromium would eventually go on to serve another planeswalker by the name of Farallon. Meanwhile, the Antiquities War raged on between Urza and Mishra, which ultimately ended in the Silex Blast that, at the request of Urza, formed a protective zone around Dominia and 11 other worlds. This was known specifically as the Shard of 12 Worlds. During the summit of the Null Moon, some of the planeswalkers that had gathered aimed to break the shard containing them by getting the other planeswalkers to fight and hopefully kill one to release enough energy to break the shard. Chromium was ultimately slain in this battle, and his death did release enough energy to allow Farallon and Leshrock to escape, but was not successful in permanently breaking the shard. Making exception for Nicol Bolas, palladia-mors is probably the most vicious of the Elder Dragons. Shortly after hatching, she became interested only in hunting and eating, and generally has a nasty attitude towards most things. This is reflected in the imagery of her, which always displays aggression. Other than that, not much is known about Palladia. The only solid piece of lore we have about her is her attack on Mors Ridge, where she continues to be cast asleep by the High Council. Perhaps we'll be able to get more lore about her as the M19 storyline plays out. Vayvictis, along with his sister Piru, were hatched on a different unknown plane. Sometime before Farallon took Chromium as a servant, he turned Vayvictis into a small dragon whelp. This stripped Vayvictis of most of his abilities, so he went on and pretended to be the servant of a man called Red Donald. Vayvictis eventually manipulated Red Donald into taking them to Mors Ridge and digging a series of canals during a storm. These canals awoke Palladia from the Tickery spell, where Vayvictis then convinced her to reverse his whelp state through the use of a black mana battery. The two began to attack the town, and during this, Vayvictis went on to battle with Chromium, who was able to reason with him that he was simply a pawn for Palladia, who would then kill him in his weakened state after fighting Chromium. Nicol Bolas has become a major villain and one of the most powerful planeswalkers within the Magic multiverse over the last few years. Nicol and his twin Ugin were said to have hatched from the same egg, where they took one name each and were each much smaller than a typical dragon. Together they perfected their skills with the eventual notion that they would avenge the death of one of their sisters, Marevia Sal, who was killed by humans shortly after hatching. Nicol would eventually add the name Bolas himself in order to have a similar two-name scheme as his siblings. As Bolas continued to become more powerful and dominate entire planes, his brother Ugin, along with another planeswalker named Azor, hatched a plan to defeat him once and for all on Ixalan after imprisoning the Eldrazi on Zendikar. Nicol figured out this plan and killed Ugin in the ensuing combat before digging into his mind to find where the Eldrazi were being kept. Sarkhan Vol, a planeswalker on Tarkir, found his mind clouded with the pleas of a physically dead but spiritually existent Ugin. Sarkhan ultimately traveled back in time over 1,000 years in order to prevent Ugin from dying in his battle. This results in many changes. The Khans of Tarkir timeline never occurred. Dragons of Tarkir is the new timeline. Sarkhan Vol is in a limbo where he is a temporal causality and both exists and doesn't. And Ugin was never killed by Nicol Bolas. In current events, Bolas has completely taken over Amonkhet. He very mercifully defeated the Gatewatch, giving each planeswalker an opportunity to flee before dying. His current sights are set on getting his power back that has been lost, which has been hinted will be played out in the storyline of the next expansions taking place on Ravnica. Before we let this video close, we should probably discuss the mess that is Ugin and his origin story. Like a lot of the current Magic lore, it is made up of retro-continuative details. The first references to Ugin only seem to go as far back as 2007 in the flavor text of a Future Sight card named Ghostfire. Only those gifted with the eye of Ugin, the spirit dragon, can see his fiery breath. In fact, there was actually already an origin story for Ugin called How Many Eyes by Matt Cavada, which explained Ugin's emergence from a rift in time. Rather than simply keeping this origin story, the decision was made to retroactively make him into Nicol Bolas' twin brother, as revealed in the short story mentioned earlier. What do you think about this change? Anyway, that's it for this episode of MTG Vintage Flashback. If you like what you saw, please leave a like on the video. If you want to know when all of our new videos come out, go ahead and subscribe to get notified. Thanks for watching.